All right, welcome everybody to another episode of Good with Pixels. Today we are going to be talking about building strong culture. The idea of strong brand and strong culture to me is the idea that you have a team and you have systems in place to stay strong and to stay positive and collaborative despite where business is at, despite maybe going through hard times. And we look at the nonprofit sector and we look at the social impact sector, there's been a lot of changes over the last few years. I know there's a lot of organizations out there kind of having a hard time or struggling to grow, struggling to hit some of their fundraising goals. And it's really important that as organizations, we can build a culture and a brand that can sustain that and can go through that. So today we're talking to Tiffany Keesey, who is the co-founder at Conscious Culture. Tiffany and I go way back. We worked together back with Invisible Children. We had Tiffany come in and help us at 50 and 50 to do some brand work when we needed to land on good core values and really who we were as an organization. Years of experience in doing this work in terms of building teams. So Tiffany, why don't you jump in, tell everybody a little bit more about yourself?
Thanks, Javan. It's great to be here. Like Javan said, I'm the founder of Conscious Culture, and I've spent about 2 decades in the people operations HR world, and both in-house as well as consulting for about a decade each. And I think really for me, at my core, I've realized I am such a people person, for lack of a better term, and that's why I do this work. But really value community building, both inside of work and outside of work. But how are we bringing people together around shared goals, shared values, shared mission and purpose? And then I also just really deeply love investing into people to help them see their potential and grow and become better versions of themselves. So at Conscious Culture, we work with a lot of very conscious brands in the nonprofit sector and without to help them build a really strong HR infrastructure and foundation so that they can attract the right people, that they can invest in them, develop them, retain them, and that everyone can thrive and really be rowing in the same direction so that we're able to hit these big ambitious goals that we have.
And I think for me, it's honestly a weakness of mine. I'm so geared towards the idea of just the end product and what the end work is, whether that's an internal project or like the missional work. And oftentimes you run people over in that. And I feel like that's something I constantly need to be checking for myself personally as a leader is, are people feeling taken care of, or do they feel invested in? So I love the work that you did there. At least going back to when we worked together, that was Invisible Children. I'd love to go back to that a little bit, just because for me that was foundational. That was the first organization I was working with in the nonprofit space with such a big mission. There was so much going on there, so many late nights, so much kind of craziness in what we were trying to accomplish as a bunch of 20 somethings. I'd love to hear it from your side because I was so driven by what we were producing, the books, the videos. And I know we were all slaving away. And in your hands was this idea of building that culture, making sure everybody felt appreciated and supported. And I felt that. I think the team felt that. So I'd love to hear your perspective kind of on stuff that maybe stuck with you with the work that we did there.
Absolutely. And I think, Javin, so many leaders can relate to you. And I would say from working with you, you do really care, but you're just focused on other things. And maybe like your strengths are aligned with running the business in a way where you should be focused on other things. And so I think that's where, whether you have a consultant like us or an internal head of people, like we are the ones like bringing that perspective and helping the leaders look internally, where a lot of times like the folks in your role need to be looking externally or looking ahead. But yeah, Invisible Children was an incredibly formative time. I feel like as a person, it was so incredibly formative. Professionally, it was so incredibly formative. It was, I think, I started it right out of college. And so I had just graduated from UCLA. I just knew I loved the mission. I wanted to be a part of it. Started as a volunteer answering phones. And as we started doing this mass hiring, the person, Margie, who was in charge of it, happened to be out and was like, Tiffany, just start hiring. And so as so many of us did, I just jumped into a role that I had never done before and figured it out on the go. And then from there, the one of the founders was like, you're really good at this, so just keep going. And so I kept hiring, and then over time really built out the HR and people operations function at Invisible Children, where I think over the 10 years that I was there, we hired over 1,200 individuals. I built the team from scratch and kind of the department and operations from scratch. And it was so much just learning as we went, which at the time I was a bit insecure about. And now I've realized it's the best way to learn. I mean, it truly feel like I got a couple masters in terms of education from what we learned at IC. But yeah, I think kind of both the function of my role as well as just how I'm naturally wired really led me to look at the people. So I was at first primarily in charge of hiring, and then it really kind of evolved into, again, how do we develop these team members? How do we set the right expectations and hold them to them? What are our performance processes? How are we recognizing people? Just all the things that come along with HR and people ops. And I think we had a saying at Invisible Children that people came for the cause, but they stayed for the community. I think we just fell into like, gosh, the community, the people here are so motivating, and it's why people want to stay here, because it was this incredible group of just highly talented individuals that we like sharpened each other, we elevated each other, and we brought out the best in one another. And so we just got to see very early on how powerful it was to have a strongly motivated, really talented group of people. And so and I know we couldn't pay people market rate. I think that was a huge part of it too, is like we didn't have the budget to pay people very highly, and so we knew that we had to complement that by making it an incredible experience to work here, as well as an incredible learning experience that was going to serve people in whatever they did next. So I started really investing into how do we live out our values, like how do we articulate them, but how do we live them out? How do we make sure we're developing people's skills and strengths? How do we make sure we're like really building a strong sense of community and support? Because things are hard, and they got really hard at points, and it was a wild ride. And so yeah, silly things from like I started a fun committee to build like to create social events, to making sure that we were really like building in kind of like recognition, gratitude, appreciation into just like all of the rhythms in which we operated. But it really wasn't just me. I think I learned so much from the other leaders as well, of like the ways that they led that created such strong culture. And we just worked to kind of buffer that and foster it as we grew. So as we went through different stages, how do we stay true to our values, to who we are, to what we care about, so that we can professionalize while maintaining like the heart and soul of the organization?
Yeah, I want to dive into, we keep coming back to that idea of the values, and I think that's the kind of a critical differentiator, because I think when you look back, you want to say like, oh, well, it was really popular, it was growing, it had a, a really powerful mission. Like that was stuff that was crafted by us. Like you said, the salaries were smaller than what we wanted them to be. The offices were grungy. They smelled terrible. Like the vans, the interns, like nobody
Running
was
around
getting.
barefoot in the offices. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and to this day, it was like we did multiple overnighters to get things out the door. Like it was in most metrics, it was a really difficult place to work, but it was an amazing place to work, right? So you're going back to this idea of values. I want to unpack that a bit, because I think a lot of organizations, you want to there's reasons for it to be challenging, but they're not excuses. And I feel like that was a place where it's like, man, we had so many excuses to be like, yeah, it's tough, like this, it's hard to have good culture, but we didn't take them as that, and it stayed really strong, right, through a lot of really challenging stuff. So I'd love to unpack values, or unpack maybe what you see as the core components that leaders do or companies do to ensure that kind of the push or the blowback or the challenges get buffered and organized inside of something like values, something like your rhythms or your team building, so that you don't feel it. The rest of your team doesn't feel the impact of some of the things that the organization's going through.
Yeah, yeah, or that they feel it to a lesser degree, right?
Yeah.
Or that they feel, because I think we don't shy away from those challenges, but there's an honesty about it, as well as then the optimism of being able to get through it and buffering your team through it. But yeah, I think it's both values and mission, kind of like the mission and purpose. I would say those go hand in hand. But I like to say now that culture is values as lived out through behaviors. And I think a lot of organizations know what their values are. They have statements or words that are on the wall or in a deck somewhere, but they need to be lived out every day through the ways that we communicate, how we make decisions, how we recognize and honor people's contributions. It's thinking about like not only how do we articulate values and not just have them be these like lofty inspirational statements, but have them be really concrete behaviors that are really like a set of performance criteria. We're using them for hiring of like, are people aligned with these values? And then we're sharing them during onboarding of like, this is what we expect of you. This is how we expect you to act and operate and behave and collaborate with people. This is how we expect you to treat people internally and externally. And then as you go through your performance management of giving people feedback and doing reviews, you're coming back to them. Like they are just as important as the job descriptions and the goals and the KPIs. And they're much harder to manage too because they are sometimes intangible, right? It's hard to tell someone, hey, you have a bad attitude. That's so like not concrete. But if you can say, hey, one of our values is like invisible children, one of them was really around like service and sacrifice. And so if something went wrong, we rolled up our sleeves and we got in there and we figured it out. And you saw even up to like the CEO, the founders, they weren't afraid to like take out the trash when it needed to be taken out. So to come back to it, it's like, how do you articulate your values? How do you make them concrete of just everyday behaviors that people know? What does teamwork actually look like in practice? What does it mean here to our organization? And how do I live that out every day? And then you want to embed it into your people systems from hiring, onboarding, performance management, and you want to make sure you're modeling it. And so it's really important for leaders to be involved in that because people are going to believe what you do, not what you say. So as leaders are modeling the values, they're really setting the tone for that as well. So I think we really had all of those at Invisible Children. And then we also had just really great storytelling and recognition rhythms around our values and our mission. So this was something that our CEO, Ben, would leave every staff meeting with was we had like inspiration time. And it was everyone's favorite part of the staff meeting. Do you remember it, Javan? When
Yeah.
we'd open it up to everyone, whether you were like an intern or an executive, and it was just sharing inspiring stories from the week. So whether it was an email from a supporter or some impact of like one of our programs on the ground in Central East Africa, and it could be big or small, but we would always start with the inspiration, which really tied back to like the impact, the purpose, the mission. And so it kept us grounded every week and like, here's what we're working towards and here's the impact we're having. And I believe we were all really motivated by that. Like we're all there because we believed in what we were doing and we wanted to make a difference. And so when we have these huge goals of like, let's end this like long-standing conflict on a different continent, like you have to celebrate incremental progress and understand like the where you're making the impact to keep you grounded in the fight and to keep you grounded in the work. So we did that, I think, incredibly well too, is continuing to get people connected to the impact. And then I think it was also very helpful as we started sending more of our staff over to mostly Uganda and like bringing our Ugandan staff out here as well. And like just those connections started forming and we just had this deep understanding of the importance and the impact of the work.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that vividly. That was awesome to have like Jolie and different people in the office. It just made it feel so much more real. And I think, especially for international organizations where so many of your staff and team can't experience that, how do you bring that home, right? Which kind of leads me to where I want to go with the conversation, which is around kind of uncertain times or times of challenges within an organization. I think that's when stuff like this starts to be more and more difficult to invest in. Similar to brand, I just had a conversation with some people yesterday around this idea that when you need it most, right, is when it's hard to find the time and the resources to invest in it. And so I think that's a challenge for a lot of organizations when you need it most, that brand is maybe something you start to, or culture, something that you start to back off on a little bit and prioritize fundraising or missional work. And I wonder if you have any advice for people in terms of what they could be doing to kind of keep this idea of culture front and center in times of struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in times of struggle, it's even more important because whether you're dealing with like fundraising challenges or layoffs, people are feeling that stress. They're feeling the uncertainty of, will I have a job? Or like, what's going to happen to the work that we're doing? Oftentimes, people are taking on more than they've had to in the past for either not an increase in pay, sometimes less pay. And you just start to see like we're asking more of our people, but the conditions are harder. And so it's something really important to keep in mind. And I would start like really simple. Sometimes going back to the basics are the most powerful. So first of all, are we recognizing people? If we're asking people to do more, are we saying, Javan, I see you. I see the work you're doing. I know it's more than usual. I know you didn't get a pay raise. Like, I appreciate you. So making sure people feel seen, because it can feel very invisible of I'm taking on more and I'm not getting recognized. And does this matter? Is anyone seeing this? So really that recognition goes a long way. And I would say positive feedback feels like something that we're good at, but oftentimes we're not. It's like, how do you give good positive feedback? And I think we did a training with the 50 team on this of like, good feedback is specific, it's well timed, it shares the impact. So instead of just saying like, hey, great job, team, you're doing amazing. Again, it's acknowledging this is a hard time, but I saw the way that I saw you staying here until, late at night and how you really tackled this complex project. And here's the impact that it had. It made my life so much easier, or it, had X, Y, and Z impact. And in that way, just like that simple human recognition and positive feedback goes a really long way.
Yeah.
So that would be the first thing that I would say. And then again, I would say look for the joy and the levity and the positivity where you can and celebrate those incremental pieces of progress. Another thing that our CEO, Ben, would say was like, nothing is more motivating than progress. And on the flip side, like it is very demoralizing to stay in the hard for a long time. It's hard. It takes real resilience. It very is much wearing. And I've learned a lot about the nervous system and like nervous system regulation in the last decade. And it's true at a nervous system level. If we're staying in the hard all the time, we're going over threshold. That's where you like get to these burnout states. But every time we can orient towards like the positive, whether it's joy, laughter, celebration, it actually helps us expand our resilience and become more
Mhm.
resilient to the hard things. So, how do we not just stay in the hard day in and day out? So, whether that is just, again, social support and connection, whether that's like we can celebrate like that we found these savings here, or we made like this huge, like we got this grant here, like make the most of what you can celebrate, because people need that. We need to be able to have that kind of hope and optimism that things will be better. Uh, and then I'll also say, I think there's a lot of things that we could talk about here, but those are kind of some of the basics. I think there's a level of transparency you can have with your team as well. The other really hard thing about being in the hard is that it can feel like we don't have agency. It can feel like, well, what can I do? Like this feels overwhelming because we're at such a funding deficit or whatever it might be. And so how do you have enough transparency with your team and then invite them into the process? Like, what can they do in their roles to help us get back to where we want to be? Is there some way of empowering them so that they feel like they can play a role in helping kind of get us back on track? But the good thing is that like the hard times can actually really make us better as we make the important and hard decisions about what to like say no to or let go of. It can actually like really bring us together. It just takes a lot of like communication, transparency, building trust and bringing people along with you.
Yeah, something else you worked with us on too is even navigating the harder conversations, which I actually really appreciated too, because oftentimes some of this burden might be something internal, whether it's a team member not carrying weight or having bad performance or whatever it might be. And navigating those in a way that doesn't feel so overbearing is really helpful too. So that, and what I really appreciated when we talked the idea of kind of that framework where you're first asking permission, you're guiding them through the challenge, you're asking them to respond. Do they have any input or feedback on that before then saying, hey, well, here's how we can move forward and kind of avoid that in the next steps. Like that kind of framework of how to even navigate tougher conversations made those a lot easier for us to just have and move on. It wasn't something where it's like, oh man, I'm dreading that one-on-one later today. It's like, no, we're just going to have an open conversation about it. We're going to be invited into it. So nobody's thrown off guard. It doesn't trigger anybody's emotions. We have a constructive conversation. We end on a positive note and we move on. So that was really helpful for us, even to navigate the other side of that. Not only the appreciations, but also can you have hard conversations with the team where people don't feel underappreciated or kind of some of the things you were mentioning earlier. So I think
Absolutely.
I think
It's
that's
so
critical
important.
on both sides, right? Yeah. Well, I wanted to dive in a little bit to just this idea of conscious culture, right? You've named it as an organ as your company, the name conscious culture. I want to ask a little bit, dive in a little bit deeper onto what that means, right? What does it look like when somebody is conscious? We talked a little bit about living it out, about it being, values that you live by. I was thinking earlier that Dan Eldon quote, that journey is the destination. It's how you're operating your business every day is what matters in the long run. And so let's talk a little bit about, the big picture. What is a conscious culture? What are you trying to craft for organizations?
Absolutely. I'm going to start by talking about what it isn't, and then I'll talk about what it is, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about culture, and it can feel like this very fluffy, nice to have thing, right? Where it's just like, well, of course, it'd be nice if we could have like kombucha on tap and ping pong tables, and those are all perks. I think a lot of times what we think about as culture are actually perks of like you can bring your dog to work or whatever it may be. And so culture is actually much more embedded than that, and it's not as sexy, I guess, in some ways, because it's really about like what are the team norms and how we communicate, how we operate, how we make decisions. It's things like do we get input before we make decisions? How easy is it to set up like a meeting with someone? How collaborative are we? Does my opinion matter? Like it's all these really small micro moments that create culture. And so a conscious culture is really thinking about every company has a culture. You absolutely do. Every company has a culture, whether you know it or not, or whether you're cultivating it thoughtfully or not, you have a culture. There's a way that people operate that they've seen modeled for them and that they're going to then follow and kind of act accordingly. And so conscious culture really came around this idea of like every company has a culture. And so do you know what your culture is? And is it what you want it to be? Like, are you intentionally fostering and cultivating a culture that brings out the best in your people and a culture that kind of brings about the outcomes that you want? And so we really kind of work with companies to, a lot of times, maybe we are going back to identifying those values, or we're talking about the ethos of what are the expectations we have for people and how do we hold them accountable to them and how do we collaborate across different departments that get siloed. So it's really kind of that like every day those micro moments, and as we identify what we want it to be, then we can do some of the structural work around managing change. And so whether that's kind of need to change who we're hiring because we're not hiring people who are culture aligned and values aligned, or people don't know what their roles and expectations are, so let's make that foundationally clear, and then we can hold them accountable because we can't hold them accountable to expectations we've never communicated. So long answer short, conscious culture is really about trying to intentionally foster the culture that you want based around what your unique values are, and what your goals are and how you want your team to operate in alignment with where you'd like to go.
I love that. I think you started with communication, and I think that stuck with me. So probably we'll stick with a lot of other leaders and organizations, and I want to dive in a little bit to maybe some common mistakes or some good habits people could have in that kind of communication space. I think we have strong values as an agency, and on the Donately side as well. Those values are there. The team alignment is there. I think both of our organizations, probably under my leadership, right? The hardest part is communication, forgetting to communicate some of those values or forgetting to get some of those inputs. Again, my focus being so uh, uh, intentionally on the end product. Are we making something powerful for our client? Is the user experience of the things we're building what we want it to be? And oftentimes that doesn't include that process of communication, of inputs, and trying to live out those values. So talk a little bit about some of the communication habits that maybe build trust, and maybe habits that would erode that trust, even if it's well intended, right? What are we doing right and what are we doing wrong as organizations to make an impact on that?
Yeah. Communication is so important. I think this also evolves based on the stage that you're in and the size of your team. It's like when you're at a certain size, you can all sit around one room, and communication is, or like sit in one room around one table, proverbially, or like literally. And the communication is a little more organic. And so I think especially as you grow and you just don't have these natural touch points with every person, thinking about what are these internal communication structures so that people have the information they need to do their job, so they feel in the loop, they feel included. And so I'd be looking at a couple key things. So what's the rhythm of our all hands? And so we've seen companies do that from every week to every other week to once a month. And I think it's really kind of testing and it's kind of based on your size. I think there's can be a real benefit to it being once a month where it feels like it's a big commitment for everyone to give the hour of their time, but also maybe it's things are moving so quickly that it does need to be weekly. But thinking about like what is the frequency of those meetings? What's the purpose of those meetings? And then what's the agenda? Because a lot of times these meetings can just devolve into project status updates, which are helpful and important, but they're not the most meaningful conversations to be having. And they're not always the best way to like update your team or keep people engaged and kind of center around what's most important. So really kind of crafting what's the frequency, what's the agenda of our all hands meetings, and then looking at what's the frequency of our department meetings or stand-ups, and what's the frequency of our one-on-ones between the managers and their direct reports. And for one-on-ones, these are like such a crucial piece of like the internal communication puzzle, and they should be happening weekly or every other week. Usually, managers balk at that. They're like, I don't have time to do this weekly, or I don't have time to do this every other week. But the reality is, it saves you so much time because people can save all their questions or the things that they need feedback on for that one-on-one. And that's like their only time often that they get your undivided attention as a manager. So this time is like precious and critical. And we always say, like, have the employee lead it because they know what's most important for them to move their work forward. And so again, how do we stay away from kind of project status updates? Maybe you can get those, like for us, we have our team members Slack us at the end of every week on just like the status so that when we're going into their one-on-one, we're having much more meaningful conversations where oftentimes they're saying, I want feedback on this work product that I developed, or can we brainstorm this because I'm kind of stuck and I want to get your input. And so they're much more kind of collaborative. So we utilize this kind of multi-channel approach of like weekly Slack updates on just like what needs to get out of the way. For other organizations, you might use something like Lattice or, 15.5, and then having the agenda of the one-on-ones feel much more of a meaningful conversation. So those are kind of the key components. And I think especially for remote cultures too, it's thinking about how often are we getting together in person for an on-site or an off-site where we are like really investing in like those relationships, because those kind of especially cross-functional relationships build so much of the trust that carries the team over the next several months. So once or twice a year, I think is really important for distributed teams to be coming together in person and just like really building that connection to one another. So those would be the things that I think are really important. And what teams do that build trust is they prioritize those. And again, they're kind of looking at, is this working for us? And they're willing to kind of iterate and tweak the format. And then the things that erode trust are really like not making those meetings sacred. It's when like as a manager, we feel so busy that we're constantly canceling our one-on-ones. And then the team member feels like, well, I'm just not important, or like I must not be a priority, right? And I see how busy you are and I don't want to bother you, but now I'm just alone here to figure it out on my own. So I think we can erode a lot of trust when we deprioritize one-on-ones or like review meetings or any of these meetings. And I think we just undermine our own efficacy when we're not thinking thoughtfully about what the agenda of these meetings can be. So those would be the things. And then I would say too, like the other things that build trust is just honesty and vulnerability as a leader. If you're facing uncertainty, saying things like, we've never been here before and we're figuring it out, or here's what we learned from like how hard of a time that was, right? Like really showing that self-reflection as well of your people don't expect you to be perfect, but they do expect you to show up, to learn, to evolve, and to kind of communicate that back.
It's all super helpful. You touched on the idea of getting teams together, which I think is new. It's new for us. I feel like, since the pandemic, it's been a while, so maybe a lot of people have solved this. We haven't, right? We turned into hybrid organizations, and it just does not feel the same on a day-to-day basis for us all to be working. You're in your house, I'm in my house. We can have these times of brainstorm, but it feels so much more separated than it used to be, where we had lunches together and we could collaborate and stand next to each other and whiteboards. And yeah, there's all sorts of technical tools that solve for this, but it just has become harder. I'd love to talk about kind of what has permanently shifted. and maybe things that we need to unlearn. I think there was a time when it was necessary that we separated, and we don't need to get into all of that. Whatever that was, we're 5 years, 4 years past it, and really trying to reshape our habits and our culture. I'd love to hear about kind of your thoughts on maybe things that we can go back to, or things that are permanently changed, and kind of how it looks now versus how it looked 5 years ago.
Yes. I do think hybrid work is here to stay, and there's massive benefits along with kind of the massive challenges that you just mentioned. But the reality is people really love it. And I think I remember working in an office too, and there's just so many meetings and pop bys and like, hey, do you have a minute, that you never feel like you can get deep work done. And so think the real value of hybrid, especially. And I think hybrid might be the best setup personally, of like a few days in the office and a few days at home, because then
Yeah.
you get that real collaboration and those like organic moments and brainstorming. But then you have maybe a day or two a week where you can do much more of your head down focus work. Because I think that is the thing that we lose when we're just back in person, is it's so hard to carve out time to do the
Yeah.
focused deep work that actually moves things forward. Um, and I think where organizations are really navigating this. I don't think anyone has it perfectly figured out. But I know for us, because we're all distributed now too at Conscious Culture. And so we've made a commitment of like our full team needs to be get together twice a year. And then my partner Bentley and I, we're going to try and get together like 3 to 4 times a year. And then we save our like strategic brainstorming, like we if you can on the quarterly basis, we like have like the really good conversations together. So last time we were together, we actually rewrote our values, because Bentley and I had jotted down some notes like when we first started, but we felt like let's all do this together, or we'll do a lot of our strategy and planning together. And so, and then when we worked with larger teams and they have their on-sites, they do a lot of different like cross-functional collaborative working sessions or sprints or like different trainings. And so I think if you're fully remote, or like mostly hybrid, how often does the team need to come together? Anything more than twice a year might be hard. And so you also are seeing sometimes like departments will have their little like kind of on sites throughout the year too. But I think it's absolutely critical to have some time in person, because it does deepen those working relationships, build that trust, even build an understanding of like how you work is different than how I work, and it helps us collaborate a lot more seamlessly. But yeah, I think we're still figuring out the hybrid work environment, and how do we
Yeah.
brainstorm remotely? Um, how do we make sure that we're yeah, because I'm not sure we're ever going to go fully back to the office. Some companies have, but it
Yeah.
still is kind of a work in progress. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Probably for most of us, that's probably not going to come back.
Yeah.
I wanted to cover one more thing, which is really around gauging how well we're doing, right? So I think a, it's a little tricky, but I think it can be done, right? How do we measure how well we're doing, kind of like success metrics, when it comes to having that culture that we're living out, and that the team is feeling good about?
Absolutely. And it's important to try and set up some of those metrics, because otherwise, I know I felt this when I was in house, you kind of hear a lot of things. And so you can constantly be hearing like, morale is bad, morale is bad. And it's the hard, and it's not really like data driven. And so how do we actually look at what are the metrics to see how we're actually doing, and what are the levers that we can pull to really improve employee experience, employee engagement, and kind of collaboration and productivity, and all of these things that we want. So typically how we start out our engagements with our clients is we do an engagement survey, and we kind of craft a series of questions that are all geared towards employee engagement and employee experience from a range of things, from both like, do I understand what my organization's goals are, to do I understand what's expected of me and how my work contributes to those goals, to like, do I have strong relationships at work? Am I growing? Do I have opportunities for growth and development? And so we want to look at kind of metrics across a lot of different categories to understand what's working well, what's our baseline, and where can we improve. And there's a metric in there too that we often use in the people ops world called the employee net promoter score. And it's taken from like the net promoter score, which I'm not sure if you guys use that, but it gauges like what are you, it usually comes from like the customer, like the product world. So like
Yeah.
how happy are our customers with our product, and like will they share it with their friends and family? Will they tell people about it? Because if they are telling people about it, that means like they really are our brand ambassadors. So we've translated that to the people ops world, and it's just a simple question of, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend our workplace to, friends or colleagues? And so that can be like a really great, just like baseline indicator of how your culture is doing. And then we like to track it over time. And so sending out engagement surveys once a year is usually a good rhythm. And then looking at what are we doing well? What can we celebrate? I'm going back to the celebration. And then
Yeah.
what are the things that are really impacting people? That isn't just hearsay, one-off things, but like now we can look at the data and the trends to say, oh, we really need to look at compensation, or people really want to understand what their career paths are. Or, a lot of times it's like people don't understand what their roles are and where their roles stop and start. And so it can give us really good insight into the most impactful activities to lean into to be able to improve your culture and your employee experience. So I would say engagement surveys, using the employee net promoter score as a part of that. And then you can also be looking at data like what are our retention statistics looking like? Like, are we losing people? And if so, why? Or are we keeping people around? And then the last thing I'll say on the metrics point, and I said this a little bit earlier, but is you can't hold people accountable to expectations that you haven't clearly communicated. So it's really important to be thinking through what are our expectations, both on like the goals, maybe the KPIs if you do those, as well as those behavioral values-based expectations, and how do we make sure we really define those and that we're coming back to those. We're giving people feedback on how they're doing, where they can improve. It's what we come back to in reviews if we're doing reviews, but making sure people are very clear on like what their success indicators are. Like, what does it look like for me to be successful in my role? So those are all things that we can kind of be tracking or like working on in order to make sure this isn't just based on like hunches or like one person's opinion of the loudest voice in the room, but really looking at what's important across the organization.
I love that.
The last thing
Um,
I'll say there is like you don't have to like focus on everything at once.
yeah.
So oftentimes we work with that on our clients of like, let's stage this out. Let's really, it's going to take time to create change, and you don't want to do too much too soon. So you don't have to act on every single piece of feedback. So your people will give you feedback, and our job is to listen, to say thank you, I hear you, and here's why I'm going to act on it, or here's why we can't act on it right now, but let's revisit it down the line. Just because you're asking for feedback doesn't mean you're beholden to act on everything. It's your job as a leader to sort through and say, here's what we're going to take action on, and here's what we're going to hold off on, and then communicating that back to your people too.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes I have the habit of looking for a silver bullet, right? I'm hoping that somebody like you comes in and goes, "Oh, this is the one thing you need to be doing is you need to be doing better, skip level meetings with the entire staff or a better town hall." And oftentimes it's this rhythms of really living out the values, but it's one decision at a time. So maybe there's quick advice you could give. I'll start with what I've heard today that I already feel like I want to bring back to my teams. First off, we do an all hands that is a little more. It's a couple times a week where we're just getting in, making sure everybody can go through anything that they are held up on or what they need. But what I'm not doing is taking that opportunity where my team is together to throw in some positivity and some culture based conversation. So even things that we're working on to improve on, collaboration being one of our values, care being one of our values, right? Where are we making moves as an organization to make things better? Just as a quick intro to get the ball rolling, and then okay, now based on that, let's jump in. Let's see what anybody needs, and we can round robin through the team. So that's one quick win for me, is just to inject that in and be kind of a leader before those meetings start. Second one is we do have those one-on-ones too at the team level, and I do work to prioritize those and make sure that we have time to hear from the team. We are in a process of restructuring those, just to give a little behind the curtain for us. And I think as I do that, I want that to be an opportunity where I do lead with a lot of affirmation. It's so easy to jump in and be like, okay, here's a problem that we're solving. And I just get into the weeds really quickly. Hey, our projects are doing this, or hey, we have this problem with a roadmap moving too slow or whatever. How do we solve for that? Versus taking even just a few minutes before that to compliment in and to kind of come in with, hey, here's what you're doing so well, and I appreciate that. And just be quick, but again, see them, honor them, visualize the positivity in what they're doing before then kind of jumping into a lot of the things that are obviously it's a production meeting. We're going to move through things that we need to be doing. Um, and then celebrations. We have done those. I think we probably implemented them back when we worked with you, when we do our quarterly town halls and our big check ins on how the business is doing. We do celebrate. We celebrate the hires. We celebrate the quotes from our clients. We celebrate the wins. We celebrate the work our clients do, right? Working with nonprofits, I'm most proud of the work that they do when we empower a mission to grow or to raise a bunch of money or to do work on the ground. So I love digging in and finding out, hey, here's a story of a family who got to be reunited, and that was the work, that the branding work and the website work that we did. This is what's coming from that. Our families coming back together, refugees seeing each other again, to celebrate what's happening downstream so that everybody can be a part of that. So those are a few things I'm going to do just immediately to kind of remind myself that there's some quick wins. What else, as we wrap up here today, do you advise that could be some kind of quick wins for organizations to try to just make improvements to the culture that they've got?
Yeah. Well, I'll say kind of one thing of going back to if you're a leader who doesn't feel like this is your natural orientation, think about who your culture champions are on your team because you have those people. You have those people that just like this is where they shine. And so, how can you kind of pull them in and also source ideas from them? Like, we don't have to have all the ideas as the leaders. And so, sometimes the best ideas can come from others of how do we make our team meetings feel more fresh and inspiring, or how do we make our celebrations feel like actually fun? And you really might get some great, information and inspiration from your team. So, don't feel like it has to be all on you. You can open it up and bring in folks that can really maybe bring a new insight or fresh ideas to the work. So that'd be one thing I would say. And then going back to what you said about one-on-ones, Javin, I really love that. I think one mistake folks make a lot is that they don't prepare for one-on-one meetings. They come in like rushing, overwhelmed. And so even taking 5 minutes to prepare for your one-on-ones is so powerful because you can identify that like positive feedback, like you said, but you also can identify like where is some coaching and constructive feedback that I can give. And I do think that's so important to do is like people actually want more constructive feedback than they want positive feedback. The studies show that. They show that like because I think oftentimes we know what we're doing well. And of course, it feels really good to feel seen and valued. That's very important. It also builds trust and kind of builds that tank for when things are hard. Um, but I don't always know like where I'm hitting, like if I'm hitting a wall, how do I do it differently? Like we have blind spots and we can't always see those ourselves. And so feedback is actually really a gift. And I think as leaders, we're scared of giving positive feedback. Well, we're either one or two directions. We're like too direct and like, hurting people's feelings, or like we're too shy and avoidant because we don't want to cause conflict or upset people, or gosh, times are hard right now. How can I come down on someone for something petty? And I just want to reframe that. Like Brene Brown says, clear is kind. And I see that time and time again that when we approach feedback, when it's not a big deal, but it's a coaching moment of like, hey, I saw you kind of hitting a wall here and let's talk about how you can do that differently. Or hey, when you didn't send the agenda out ahead of the meeting, the group didn't come as prepared. Like, let's talk about how you can do that differently to prepare the group for a better brainstorm. Like that's actually an investment. And I think it shows care. And it's really helping develop your people to be better. So don't shy away from the constructive feedback, even when times are hard, because your high performers want to know how they can be improving. They want to feel that investment from you. And if you're approaching it in the right way, they will feel like you're partnering with them and they really will feel invested in. So prepare for your one-on-ones. Don't shy away from the constructive feedback. Build in the appreciation, the joy, like we talked about. And then I think the last thing that we haven't touched on that's important is you do need to address any issues on your team. If there are like chronic underperformers or someone who's really disengaged and disgruntled, like nothing pulls down the morale of the team and the engagement of a team like someone who's really unhappy and poor, like, and when you're tolerating poor performance. And again, studies have found that like groups performance drops to the level of the lowest common denominator. And so it really has a huge outsized impact on the team when they see you tolerating poor performance. And it's like, well, why should I be busting my ass if like this person's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
skating by, right? And so Don't shy away also from those hard conversations and those hard decisions. You can gain trust with your team when you're addressing the hard moments too. And so, especially if you have like a bad manager, that impacts people's experience so greatly. And I think in times that are uncertain, that are hard, that are challenging, let's remove the roadblocks that we know we can, and let's make sure that like the team is kind of living into the expectations we have of them. So those would be some things that I would add in, and then just thinking about how transparent do we want to communicate with the team, and how do we bring them along with us, and really kind of share honestly but optimistically, of this time is hard. Like let's state the obvious. Like we know we're going through a
Yeah.
hard time, and we believe we can get through it, and here's how, and just kind of keep that communication going, knowing that you're bringing along people for the ride with you.
Yeah, I think that's all super helpful. Some of it's easy, some of it's, affirming and, great rhythms that are really enjoyable to do as a leader and really have those fun conversations. And then some of it is tough. And part of good culture is making tough decisions. And like you said, if there's somebody there that's poisoning that, there's been times I've been in business for 15 years as an entrepreneur. There's times when you feel it, and when you take too long to address it, it can take other good people on your team away. I know I had some people leave before
Mhm.
I was able to respond to somebody like that who was in the organization that just wasn't the right fit for our culture, and it exhausts you, like you said, staying in those tough times for too long. It can really wear you down. It wears the team down, and so there is some business language out there on firing fast, that sort of thing, which is hard. I think you need to give people opportunities to grow into their role, and I think having performance reviews and conversations to be open and honest when those struggles are there, but also to not make excuses, right? And if that's something that's continuing, then that's something you got to address. So I think I appreciate that, as a decision making that impacts culture and how well you can run a positive business. Super super fun conversation, Tiffany. I want to thank you for coming and give people an opportunity to follow you and understand a little bit more about conscious culture. So where can they go if they want to get in touch with you or they want to learn more about?
Yeah, the best place is LinkedIn. And so you can look up Conscious Culture Co. That's our company. Also I'm on there, Tiffany Keesey. And so that's really the best way. We kind of dabbled with other social platforms and realized like that's not where our
No.
people in our community are. So LinkedIn is the best way. And then our website is conscious-culture.co, where you can learn more.
Great. And we'll have the links with the video, and so people can follow along. Encourage everybody to do so. Follow Tiffany, find her on LinkedIn, look up conscious culture, and tune into the next Good with Pixels episode. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks, Tiff, for coming.
Thanks for having me, Javin.
Of course.